One thing about the economy that you can count on is the cost of food increasing. It is extremely likely that the cost of the food that you're eating today will cost twice as much in a very short amount of time. And it is quite likely that the price of food will go up much more than that in not too much time thereafter. It turns out that out of all the things that you could invest in, creating the ability to create food is probably one of the surest bets you can make. And I'm going to explain a couple of insights that can make this an even more likely return on investment for you. Now, as some of you know, I've spent the last 10 years doing what I can in the environment I live in, which is very harsh for trying to grow food, but to learn how to produce more food on this land. And I see it as a series of puzzles, and it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and unfortunately a lot of money to go through these experiments. And I'd say that I'm mostly done with those, which is good, because I'm pretty much out of money for it. And because my circumstances are very different than they used to be in that regard. And I'm getting old and cranky and my back hurts. And so I have a limited amount of time left with children at home, as far as I know. And I have a list that will take up all that time. And the goal is to get things as efficient and automated as I can before they leave the house and I run out of discount labor. Anyway, one of the pitfalls that we have to overcome when we have opportunities for improvement is the temptation to think that improvements have to happen all at once, or that they have to be some major thing. And a principle that I've taught you before, that I'm going to teach you again here, is that the more you improve, the more input you're going to need for a smaller output, which sounds like bad news. The good news is, in most things, you are so early to the game, trying to put that in a positive way, that you experience that principle as a positive thing, because you're on the end of the curve, the starting end of the curve. And so for you, what this means is you can encounter incredible outcomes just by doing a little more than you're doing right now, or a little different than you're doing right now. And in this video, I'm going to go through some ideas of how you can apply that principle to growing a little more food on your property than you do right now. So maybe that amount that you grow right now is 0. That's a very common number for people. But the tips that I'm going to give you, you don't have to go buy a farm to apply. You don't have to dedicate the next 10 years of your life to running experiments on figuring out how to do this and make it work and make it make sense. Part of the help you're going to receive in this, in making it make sense, is, like I said, the fact that the food costs are going to continue to go through the roof. Now, I could make a very logical argument for why that's the case, but I want to focus on what you can do about it in this video. Okay? So, first, let's dispel a few bad ideas, a few myths about growing food on your property. Maybe the best way to approach this is to make the distinction between different motives you might have in doing this. So when most people think of growing food, they think of vegetable gardening, maybe even having some fruit trees or some sort of fruit vines or something. There's a difference between growing nutrients and growing calories. Now, if you wanted to actually get anywhere near replacing what you buy at the store, you would have to figure out a way to grow grain. It's the most overlooked piece of growing food. The good news is that's really not a good idea for you. If you're in the place that I think you are, if you're in the place that the people whose video is addressed to are, that's not what you should be worried about. Long story short, in order to do that in any kind of reasonable way, you need to have a combine, which is a specialized kind of tractor piece of equipment. It's self-propelled, and these things can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It used to be, up until the 1970s, that you could get a smaller version of this that mounted on a smaller tractor. But that size piece of equipment is not in production any longer. And so what you're looking at is a full shebang. Now you can get a full-size combine for as little as $25,000, but there are immense costs in getting it shipped to wherever you live and in maintaining it, because it's probably got a lot of hours on it at that price, and it's probably going to break down all the time. Not to mention the fact that you have to find a place to put this big old thing, and you're only going to use it once a year for like half a day, depending on how much acreage you have. So anyway, the moral of the story is grain production is very hard, and that's okay because it doesn't make any sense for you. All right, so now what should be your focus in growing food? At the first level, I would encourage you to focus on lowering your grocery bill. And I'll give you some tips on how to do that. So odds are the most expensive component of your grocery bill is things like cheese or meat, maybe eggs, milk. All of those things are really expensive to do yourself. And there can be, and likely will be, situations where prices of those things are going to go through the roof, either for a limited amount of time or just continuously. I've done a video before talking about the price of beef going up. But the fact is that that's not a good place to start, okay? You need land to, increasingly, you need more land and more labor and more know-how to handle those things. Even things that you can do at a really small scale, like getting a few chickens, you're not actually going to save any money doing that. Once you go in for the price of the coop, whatever predator protection you need, whatever lessons you have to learn in losing your flock to a raccoon or something, and then the feed, you're going to save money just buying it from the store. Now, again, it's not always going to be available. I've told you that time and again. The prices are just going to keep going up. But the point is, that's not the place to start. And actually, by doing the thing I'm about to tell you, you can get to a point where you can do that, have chickens, for example, and vastly reduce the cost of feed, and all of a sudden make it something that's approachable in ways that you can save money compared to the store. In this video, I'm not really going to give you the argument from the perspective of nutrition, although that is a very strong argument. And I'm holding my tongue to not go into that because it's something that I've looked into and something that's really important. And I'm also not going to make the argument about crazy food people doing crazy things to the food supply, although that's also something that's very important. So let's just talk about cutting your grocery bill. If you look at what you're buying right now and you ignore the cost of eggs and meat and cheese and milk, and grain, the next most expensive thing that you're looking at is probably some sort of vegetable. Now, there are things that are relatively easy to grow, depending on where you live, like potatoes, that are so dang cheap at the store that the only reason you would want to grow those is if you thought that you would be facing a sudden shortage of those and you'd like to have access to them still. So I grow some potatoes every year for that purpose. I just save them and I replant most of them every year that I dig up. And so I just have seed potatoes on hand in case we need that. And I can scale that up. I have everything prepared to do that. But that probably doesn't make sense for you. So what would I focus on if I were you? Here's the big answer. Ready? First thing I would focus on is winter squash. Second thing I would focus on is tomatoes or something like that. And the third thing I would focus on is something like kale. And let me explain each of those three things. So vegetable gardening is something that there's a lot of knowledge locked up into the specific place that you live. A lot of environment-specific variables. It's not just about your climate and your soil. It's also about your situation. So if you're by yourself, that's going to be different than if you're in a family. If you have an apartment and a balcony, that's going to be different than if you've got a postage stamp lawn. If you live in an HOA versus not, an HOA is probably not going to let you till up your lawn to plant a garden, which is something I would totally do. So there's a lot of specifics for your situation. But in general, the principle is look at what either you eat now or you'd be okay eating that costs the most money. And then that's one list, right? Or organize the things that you could grow based on how much they cost. And then look down the list for the value that you could get out of that. So for example, my wife, she really likes butternut squash. That's one variety of winter squash. It doesn't grow here. I've tried it, can't make it work. But there is a variety that's a shorter season, grows on a shorter vine. Those two things usually go together. And it would grow in most places just fine. And it's a kind of variety that you can save the seeds and regrow, which is great. There's so much knowledge about this, but I don't want to overwhelm anybody. If you like something like butternut squash, or there's a bajillion kind of winter squashes, if you find one that you like, here's the benefit of winter squash. It stores. You don't need to refrigerate it. You just put it in a cool, dry place, a dark place, and it'll last for a while. Different varieties last for a different amount of time. And so if you load up the growing area with those things, it's not just something you can pick during the season. It's something you have through the winter. And guess when vegetables cost the most? Exactly. Right? So this kind of thinking, and you can feel free to adapt it any way you need to, just go by the principles. This can absolutely reduce your grocery bill. That's why I mentioned tomatoes. In many places, not here, tomatoes can be a prolific thing that doesn't take up a whole lot of space. Again, tons of different varieties, but if you find one that you like, and one piece of advice that I'd give you is aim for one kind of whatever you're going to grow. Find the best one that works for you, and then just grow that, because you can save the seeds. And seeds are really expensive, and they'll continue to get more expensive, and they'll continue to get harder to find. So try to stay away from hybrids, because those don't, you can't harvest the seeds from those. You'll get something different. So get the heritage varieties, and try to get one kind of thing per whatever type of vegetable or fruit that you're growing. There are exceptions to that, like apple trees, but let's keep it simple. So if you grow some winter squash, you grow some tomatoes, you're probably going to noticeably offset your food bill, right? You might have to tweak how you eat and what you eat, but not by too much. You want to try to merge these things together. What you're already doing with something that's a little bit better, that gives you the maximum return on your investment, okay? So once you've got this dialed in, you can do this year after year. Now you can look into crop rotations and fertilizers and all that other jazz, but the point is to start small. It's easy to start small. And this could be a fun thing for you to do with your kids, or if you are younger, a fun thing to bring your parents in on, or just to teach them about. All right, now why did I mention kale? So kale is expensive. Most people don't like it. There's a variety that I'd highly recommend trying. It's called lacinato kale. There's a very similar variety called Black Magic. They're pretty much the same. I hope there's no kale experts out there who are going to grill me on that. Fact check, they're not the same. They're pretty much the same. And so most kales are kind of bitter and people don't really like them. These are not, okay? So give those a shot. And what's cool about kale is that it's really easy to save seed. You can get a bajillion seeds off of one plant. But I mentioned if you do this right, you can transition into having chickens. One way you can save tons of money on chickens is by growing lots of kale. And you can go out and just with a couple of plants, you can pull 5 gallons of kale off of them every single day during the season. And you can extend the season earlier and later than most other crops because it's cold resistant. In fact, you can even overwinter it by covering it with mulch. You cut it down to a stump, cover it with mulch, and then just take away the mulch in the spring and boom, you got kale again. So by doing this, you can reduce those feed bills. And now I want to mention, we're running down to the end of the list. I'm just going off a mental list here of the things I wanted to talk about. Coming back to grain. One amazing thing about grain is that if it's stored in a dry place, it will last for 30 years. The crazy thing about it is you can actually plant it at 30 years. You won't get as much germination, but it'll work. And so what do you know that you can invest in for 30 years? And how much do you think wheat is going to cost 30 years from now? And the best thing about it is people talk about how they don't like eating their food storage. Well, you can rotate your grain and get a grain mill and do all this extra work, and that's fine, you can do that. Or you can just feed it to your animals when it gets old. And so, again, it's going to be way cheaper than animal feed whenever you get around to that. So a stockpile of grain is probably not something you want to move. You don't want to get a separate moving truck just to ship your grain. But if there's an amount that fits into your budget conveniently and fits in your house conveniently somewhere, we've got a bunch of beans and grain under a ping pong table in my basement. So if you find a place and you got a couple of bucks, it's not a bad idea. And then when the time comes, you can always use that. It is massively less expensive to buy grain now than it will be to grow it later. It's a crazy freak difference right now. And it has been this way for a very long time. Because of those huge combines and the way they grow this stuff, it is ridiculously inexpensive to buy that stuff versus having to process it yourself. I've done it, I know. So, and remember that there are all kinds of different beans and grains. So wheat isn't the only one. Others are probably less expensive, but again, you'll want to hit Craigslist or whatever in your area to try to find a farmer. The closer you can get to the source, it's way cheaper. And sometimes it's not as conveniently bagged, or you might have to drive a bit to get it, but just do the math and see if it's worth it. Think outside the box. Other grains you might look at, rye. The benefit, well, rye is really great because then you can do crazy things like you can sprout it for chickens. And there are easy ways of doing that. If you're interested in finding out more, I can take the time to share some things about that with you. There's barley. So rye and barley are usually a lot cheaper than wheat. There are other grains and beans that you can get too. And legumes, you can get dried peas. So all of these things can be useful. And buying those already grown and packed up, again, it is way cheaper than the time and money and equipment and everything else you need to try to grow that stuff. So if you're just starting out, keep it simple, keep it small, and focus on the highest impact changes that you can make. And if you do these things in whatever way works best for you, I think it's very likely that you're going to see outsized returns for this, for growing some of what you eat moving forward. And it might surprise you just how significant a difference that makes.